Sarah's piercing scream tore through the cramped, despair-soaked Chicago apartment as the cold steel of a debt collector's blade bit into the throat of Marcus, her gambling-addicted husband. They were seconds away from slitting his throat over his unpaid debts until Julian the Ghost Vance, the city's most feared Mafia King, stepped forward. His low, gravelly voice cut through the panic with a brutal, uncompromising proposition. He would spare the pathetic man's life and throw in a cool $1 million in cash, with one single condition: Clara had to go with him. To Clara's absolute horror and disgust, her own mother didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. $1 million? Sarah shrieked, practically offering her daughter up. Take her. She's untouched. She can be your toy, your perfect sex slave. Witnessing her own flesh and blood sell her to a monster just to save the abusive man who had ruined their lives, Clara felt her heart shatter into a million irreparable pieces. But in that pitch-black abyss of ultimate betrayal, she swallowed her unshed tears. Stripping away every ounce of her former fragility, she locked a fierce, deadened gaze onto her mother and coldly accepted her descent into the dark alongside the devil himself. I'll go. I'm freeing you, Mom. It's time to finally break these chains. Clara turned her back on the rotting apartment, leaving the stench of stale beer and broken promises behind forever. She did not look back. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, severing the final tie to her past. Julian stood waiting in the dimly lit hallway, his tailored Italian suit absorbing the shadows. He did not touch her, nor did he offer false comfort. He simply gestured toward the waiting elevator with a subtle tilt of his head. The descent to the underground parking garage was cloaked in a suffocating silence. Clara walked stiffly, every muscle in her body wound tight, her bare arms shivering in the damp basement air. A sleek armored SUV idled in the darkest corner, surrounded by heavily armed guards who lowered their heads in absolute submission as Julian approached. Once inside the cavernous cabin of the vehicle, the heavy doors sealed them away from the world. The tinted windows blocked out the neon glare of the Chicago night, plunging them into a private, claustrophobic sphere. Julian sat across from her, his posture relaxed yet radiating a lethal, predatory energy. He poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, the soft clinking of ice the only sound cutting through the thick tension. He was observing her. Clara could feel the weight of his dark, piercing gaze mapping every inch of her pale face. He was searching for the inevitable breakdown, waiting for the frantic sobs or the desperate pleas for mercy that women usually offered when trapped in his grasp. But Clara refused to give him that satisfaction. She sat completely motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. Her heart was a hollow cavern, thoroughly stripped of all warmth by her mother's shrieking betrayal. The woman who had given her life had tossed her to a wolf without a second thought. The sheer magnitude of that realization burned away her ability to cry. Julian took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. He noted the rigid line of her shoulders and the icy defiance in her stare. This was not the trembling victim he had anticipated. Instead of a broken doll, he had purchased a girl whose spirit seemed forged in the same freezing fires that fueled his own empire. Inside her mind, a brutal war was raging. One half of Clara wanted to scream, to shatter the glass and hurl herself into the rushing traffic outside. The other half, the survivor who had spent 26 years enduring Marcus's violent outbursts and Sarah's pathetic excuses, knew she had to adapt. She was now the property of a phantom, a king who ruled an underworld of blood and shadows. If she showed weakness, he would devour her. If she panicked, she would be nothing more than the disposable plaything her mother had promised him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the armored vehicle devoured the miles of asphalt. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the impenetrable tint of the window, watching the blurred city light streak past like dying embers. She could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder radiating from the man sitting mere feet away. Julian Vance was a myth whispered in the back alleys of Chicago, a ruthless phantom who controlled the city with an iron fist. Yet here he was, breathing the same recycled air, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You are exceptionally quiet," Julian finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the plush leather seats. It was not a question, but an observation laced with dangerous curiosity. Clara slowly turned her head to meet his gaze. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light, devoid of any human warmth. "Would screaming change my current destination?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though her hands trembled slightly where they were hidden in the folds of her cheap denim jacket. A ghost of a smirk played on the corners of Julian's mouth. "No, it would only give my men a headache." "Then I see no reason to waste my breath," she replied coldly, turning her attention back to the window. Julian tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing as he analyzed her. He had expected hysteria. He had expected a weeping mess begging for her family. He had bought her on a whim, a twisted impulse to claim something pure in a room full of filth, fully prepared to lock her away or discard her when he grew bored. But the absolute void in her expression, the quiet strength radiating from her fragile frame, shifted something primal within him. She had just been sold by her own mother for pieces of paper, yet she sat there, not as a broken captive, but as a queen exiled from a ruined land. Clara felt his gaze burning into her profile, but refused to flinch. The pain of her mother's words still echoed in her ears, a toxic poison seeping into her veins. She realized then that the Clara who had worked double shifts at the diner to pay for groceries was dead. That girl had been murdered the moment Sarah accepted the money. The woman sitting in the armored car was someone new, someone hollowed out and hardened. She would endure the ghost of Chicago. She would survive his cruel world, not by pleading, but by refusing to break. The engine roared as they entered the underground tunnel leading to the penthouse, sealing her fate in the concrete and steel of his absolute domain. The armored vehicle rolled to a smooth halt in a subterranean garage bathed in harsh fluorescent light. Julian stepped out first, and his guards immediately formed a protective perimeter. Clara followed, her worn sneakers silent against the polished concrete. A private elevator whisked them upwards, soaring above the grime of the city streets for what felt like an eternity. When the silver doors slid open, Clara stepped into a sprawling penthouse. It was a fortress of glass and dark marble, offering a panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline. To anyone else, it would look like an absolute paradise. To Clara, it was nothing more than a lavishly decorated prison cell. The air inside felt cold, sterile, and heavily filtered, devoid of the chaotic life she had always known. She stood near the entrance, refusing to step further into the lion's den than necessary. Julian discarded his suit jacket onto a velvet armchair and turned to face her. His imposing figure seemed to consume all the oxygen in the massive living area. He began to lay out the reality of her new existence with a chilling detachment. She was not to leave the penthouse under any circumstances. The security system was impenetrable, and the guards stationed outside the private elevator were instructed to use lethal force on intruders. She was to obey his commands without hesitation. She would have everything she could ever need provided for her, but her freedom was no longer hers to claim. Clara stood perfectly still in the center of the room, absorbing his commands in absolute silence. She did not nod. She did not agree. She merely stared at him, her chin held defiantly high. He motioned for her to follow him down a wide, silent corridor lined with abstract paintings that looked entirely devoid of human emotion. He pushed open a set of double doors to reveal a master suite larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her mother and Marcus. The bed was massive, covered in dark silk sheets. Spread across the mattress was a collection of breathtaking designer gowns, delicate lace lingerie, and jewels that sparkled under the recessed lighting. Julian watched her face, expecting the wide-eyed wonder and instant compliance that wealth usually bought. He expected her to shed her cheap garments and drape herself in the luxury he had provided, fully transforming into the perfect submissive toy her mother had promised. Clara barely glanced at the expensive fabric. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her faded denim jacket. The contrast between her ragged clothing and the opulent surroundings was glaring, yet she wore her poverty like an impenetrable armor. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, but she forced her breathing to remain slow and steady. "Put something else on," Julian commanded, his voice a low warning. "The maid drew a bath for you. Wash the scent of that slum off your skin and dress appropriately." Clara locked her gaze with his pitch-black eyes. "No." The single word hung in the air, sharp and entirely unexpected. Julian stepped closer, his imposing height casting a dark shadow over her fragile frame. The air thickened with a sudden, electric tension. No one ever told him no. "Excuse me," he asked softly, a dangerous edge bleeding into his tone. "I said no," Clara repeated, her voice refusing to tremble. "My mother might have sold me to cover a massive gambling debt, but I did not agree to become your prostitute. I will clean your floors. I will cook your meals. I will do the work of 10 maids if that is what it takes to pay off what they owe you. But I will not dress up like a doll to entertain you." Julian stared down at her, momentarily taken aback by her sheer audacity. Women in his world bent to his will. They groveled, they manipulated, or they surrendered out of pure terror. They certainly did not stand in his bedroom, wearing threadbare jeans, and refuse his direct orders. He reached out, his large hand gripping her chin. His fingers were hot against her pale skin, forcing her to tilt her head up. He expected her to pull away or squeeze her eyes shut in fear. Instead, Clara kept her gaze wide open, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She stared right back into the eyes of the ghost of Chicago, daring him to break her. A strange, dark thrill curled in the pit of Julian's stomach. The absolute defiance in her expression did not anger him as it should have. It fascinated him. The stubborn set of her jaw and the resilient fire in her eyes ignited a possessive hunger he had never experienced before. He realized in that quiet, intense moment that Clara was not a fragile bird he had trapped in a golden cage. She was a wild creature, completely untouched by the greed that corrupted everyone else in his life. The thought of taming her sent a rush of adrenaline through his veins. He slowly released her chin, his thumb brushing deliberately across her lower lip before he pulled away. "We will see about that," he murmured, his voice thick with a newfound obsession. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clara alone with the silk dresses she would never wear. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, locking her inside, but Julian knew the true captive in that brief exchange had been him. 3 nights bled into one another. Clara spent them wandering the cavernous penthouse like a restless ghost. She kept her faded jeans and plain shirts, completely ignoring the silk and lace mocking her from the massive closet. The penthouse was dead quiet until the abrupt chime of the private elevator shattered the silence well past midnight. Clara froze in the dimly lit kitchen, a glass of water halfway to her lips. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed across the polished marble foyer. She crept toward the hallway and stopped dead. Julian leaned heavily against the cold wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. The pristine white fabric of his custom-tailored shirt was soaked in dark, glistening blood. He had returned alone from what was supposed to be a routine territorial negotiation, purposely dismissing his bodyguards to hide the severity of his injuries from the rest of his ruthless syndicate. He slipped, his massive frame hitting the floor with a heavy thud. For a fleeting second, the raw survival instinct screaming in Clara told her to run, to let the monster bleed out on his expensive floor. He was the man who had bought her like a piece of furniture. He was a criminal. But as she watched him struggle to inhale, the profound empathy that had forced her to endure her abusive household took over. She could not stand by and watch a man die. Clara rushed forward, dropping her glass. It shattered across the tiles, but she ignored the dangerous shards. She fell to her knees beside him. The metallic scent of fresh blood was overpowering in the sterile air of the penthouse. "Where is the medical kit?" she demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative, devoid of any panic. Julian blinked, his vision blurring at the edges. He expected her to scream. He expected her to grab a weapon and finish the job his enemies had started. Instead, small, warm hands were already pressing firmly against the deep laceration on his side. "Bathroom," he gritted out, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Fodham Cabinet." Clara bolted down the hall and returned seconds later with a heavy trauma kit. She dropped beside him again, her deft fingers ripping open sterile gauze and strong antiseptic. She did not hesitate as she tore his ruined shirt further to expose the gruesome wound. It was a nasty knife slice, brutally deep but thankfully missing his major organs. "This is going to burn," she warned softly. Julian did not reply. He simply watched her. His entire world was built on violence, deceit, and absolute power. Everyone who touched him either wanted to take his crown or feared his wrath. But Clara was kneeling in a pool of his blood, her delicate face scrunched in deep concentration as she meticulously cleaned the wound. She applied pressure with a fierce determination, entirely unbothered by the dark gore staining her hands and her cheap clothes. As she worked, Julian felt a strange, painful tightening in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with his physical injuries. The room was utterly silent save for their synchronized breathing. He could see the faint dark circles under her amber eyes, a clear testament to her sleepless nights locked inside his cage. Yet, her touch was incredibly gentle. She was treating the monster who had ripped her from her life with the exact same tender care one might offer a wounded animal. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. The question felt heavy, almost vulnerable, in the quiet room. Clara paused, keeping her hands firmly pressed against the thick bandages. She met his pitch-black eyes, her gaze unwavering and piercing. "Because unlike you, I do not believe a human life is something you can just throw away." The quiet conviction in her words pierced straight through the thick, icy walls he had spent 32 years building. Julian reached up, his blood-stained fingers gently wrapping around her slender wrist. He did not grip her with his usual dominant force. The touch was surprisingly tender, almost reverent. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat as the lethal Mafia King traced the delicate pulse point of her wrist. In that silent, blood-soaked moment, a profound and irreversible shift occurred within Julian. The fierce possessive hunger that had sparked on her very first night morphed into something far more dangerous and permanent. She was not a prize to be displayed. She was not a debt collected. She was the singular sliver of light in his pitch-black existence. He realized that the crack in his icy armor was no longer a minor flaw. Clara had shattered the ice completely, settling deep into his corrupted core where no one else had ever been allowed to enter. The sterile calm of the penthouse shattered 3 days later. Clara was in the kitchen brewing coffee, the bitter aroma grounding her amidst the opulent isolation. The sudden, unauthorized chime of the private elevator made her stiffen. Julian was supposed to be in his study, resting his healing wound. Heavy doors slid open, revealing not guards, but a woman who looked like she had stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. Victoria Sterling, the aristocratic daughter of a rival syndicate and Julian's political fiancé, strode into the living room with 3 armed henchmen trailing behind her. Victoria stopped dead, her perfectly manicured hands clenching her designer bag as her piercing blue eyes landed on Clara. The heiress took in the faded denim and plain cotton shirt, her perfectly painted lips curling into a vicious sneer. She stepped closer, invading the quiet space with the overpowering scent of heavy perfume. "So the rumors whispering through the underworld are true," Victoria mocked, her voice dripping with aristocratic venom. The ghost brought home a stray. "Tell me, little barista, does pouring coffee prepare you for warming a Mafia King's bed? Or are you just here to scrub the marble floors until he gets bored of your pathetic poverty?" The henchman snickered, anticipating tears or a terrified retreat. Clara simply set her coffee mug down on the granite counter with a quiet, deliberate click. She did not shrink under the crushing weight of Victoria's elite arrogance. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her amber eyes locking onto the heiress with a calm, unnerving clarity. "My clothes might be cheap, Miss Sterling," Clara replied, her tone perfectly even and devoid of intimidation. "But at least I am not desperate enough to force my way into a home where I am clearly unwanted. All the silk and diamonds in Chicago cannot mask the stench of a fragile ego." Victoria gasped, her pale face flushing with violent rage. She raised her hand to strike the insolent girl, but a cold, lethal voice froze the very air in the room. "If you touch her, Victoria, you will lose that hand." Julian emerged from the shadows of the hallway. He moved with a dangerous, predatory grace, ignoring the sharp twinge of his stitched wound. His dark eyes were devoid of any mercy as he stepped directly in front of Clara, shielding her fragile frame with his massive build. The temperature in the room plummeted. Even Victoria's hardened guards took a subconscious step back. "Julian," Victoria sputtered, trying to mask her shock with righteous indignation. "You let this filthy waitress insult your future wife? Our families have a multi-million-dollar alliance pending on our wedding." Julian did not look at his fiancée. His gaze remained fixated on the terrified guards before shifting slowly to Victoria's pale face. The possessive fury radiating from his rigid posture was absolute. "There is no wedding," Julian stated, his voice a quiet, terrifying rumble that echoed off the glass walls. "The alliance is dead. The engagement is over." Victoria stumbled back as if physically struck. "You are breaking a pact between our syndicates for a street rat? My father will burn your empire to the ground." "Let him try," Julian countered smoothly, stepping closer until Victoria was forced to retreat toward the elevator. "Now take your man and get out of my home. If I ever hear you speak her name again, I will personally send your father your head in a box." Humiliated and shaking with fury, Victoria spun on her high heels and fled into the elevator, her guards scrambling after her. As the silver doors closed, sealing the penthouse in silence once more, Julian turned his attention back to Clara. The lethal monster vanished, replaced by a man looking at his sole possession. By severing the multi-million-dollar tie, Julian had just ignited a massive war across the Chicago underworld, and he had done it all without a single second of hesitation, simply to protect the pride of the woman who held his dark heart. The fallout from breaking the Sterling alliance required an immediate demonstration of absolute power. 2 nights later, Julian ordered Clara to prepare for an exclusive underground gala hosted by the ruling families of the Chicago syndicate. There would be no hiding behind the secure walls of the penthouse. He intended to walk her directly into the Viper Pit and dare the entire criminal underworld to strike. This time, Clara did not fight him when the maids brought a dress. It was a floor-length gown of midnight black silk that clung to her curves like liquid shadow. The fabric was practically an armor of immense wealth. A delicate diamond choker rested against her collarbone, marking her as the undisputed property of the ghost. When she stepped into the dimly lit living room, Julian stared at her for a long, silent moment. The raw possessive fire blazing in his dark eyes made her breath hitch in her throat. He extended his hand, and she took it, knowing with absolute certainty that there was no turning back. The gala was held in a sprawling subterranean ballroom beneath a luxury hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast a heavy golden glow over the most dangerous men and women in the city. The moment Julian and Clara descended the grand marble staircase, the entire room went dead silent. The classical music seemed to fade into a hollow, terrifying echo. Every single pair of eyes locked onto the girl in the black silk dress. The whispers ignited immediately. They were cruel, murmuring voices dissecting her poverty and predicting her imminent gruesome death. Clara kept her spine straight, refusing to bow her head to the wolves. She focused entirely on the heavy, steady presence of the man walking beside her. Julian radiated a lethal calm that promised unholy violence to anyone who dared step out of line. For the first hour, they remained entirely untouchable. Julian kept her securely tucked against his side, introducing her not as a passing amusement, but as his permanent companion. The syndicate bosses offered tight, nervous smiles, clearly terrified by the unpredictable shift in power. However, the tension in the room was a highly combustible gas just waiting for a single spark. That spark arrived when a minor gang boss named Garrett approached. Garrett ran a ruthless smuggling ring on the South Side and was fiercely loyal to the Sterling family. He had spent the entire evening drinking heavily, his courage artificially inflated by Victoria's whispered promises of a massive reward for whoever humiliated the interloper. Julian had stepped away for exactly 2 seconds to accept a glass of bourbon from a terrified server. Garrett materialized out of the thick crowd, blocking Clara from the rest of the room. He reeked of expensive cigars and cheap stale liquor. His bloodshot eyes raked over her body with undisguised disgust and vulgar hunger. "So this is the little charity case that cost us the Sterling Alliance." Garrett sneered, his voice intentionally loud enough to draw the eager attention of the surrounding elite. "You clean up nicely for a street rat, but expensive silk does not wash away the filthy stench of the gutter." Clara felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she stubbornly held her ground. She met his blurry gaze with absolute disdain. "And custom-tailored suits do not mask the manners of a pig." A few shocked gasps rippled through the wealthy onlookers. Garrett flushed a dark, ugly shade of crimson. His wounded pride overrode any remaining sense of self-preservation. He lunged forward, and his thick, sweaty hand clamped down incredibly hard on her bare shoulder. His thick fingers dug painfully into her delicate collarbone, dragging her a step closer to his foul breath. "Listen here, you little whore." Garrett spat right in her face. "When the ghost gets bored of you, I am going to show you exactly where helpless strays belong." He never got to finish his vile threat. Before Clara could even flinch, a massive hand gripped the back of Garrett's neck with the crushing force of a steel vice. The air in the ballroom seemed to freeze completely. Julian had crossed the open space in a fraction of a second. His face was a mask of terrifying blankness. There was no visible rage in his expression, only the absolute cold void of the ghost. Garrett dropped Clara as if he had been burned, but it was entirely too late. Julian shoved the gang boss forward, sending him crashing heavily to his knees on the polished marble floor. The loud thud echoed like a gunshot. The music died completely. Hundreds of syndicate members watched in paralyzed, breathless horror. "Julian, please." Garrett babbled frantically, the alcohol evaporating from his system as he stared up at the monster standing over him. "It was just a joke. I meant absolutely no disrespect." "You touched what is mine," Julian stated. The quiet volume of his low voice carried a weight far heavier than any desperate scream. Julian did not draw a weapon. He did not issue a grand dramatic speech. He simply stepped behind the kneeling man, grabbed Garrett's chin with one hand and the back of his head with the other. With a swift, violently brutal twist that made the entire room flinch, a sickening sharp crack echoed through the silent ballroom. Garrett went entirely limp, his lifeless body collapsing onto the pristine white floor. Piercing screams erupted from a few of the wealthy women, but no one dared to move forward. The armed guards stationed around the perimeter stood frozen, waiting for Julian's next command. Julian casually adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit jacket without sparing a single passing glance at the corpse bleeding at his feet. He turned back to Clara, who was staring at the lifeless body with wide, horrified eyes. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch incredibly soft compared to the brutal murder he had just committed. Julian then looked up, sweeping his pitch-black gaze across the terrified crowd of aristocrats and killers. "Let this be the only warning," he announced, his voice cutting through the panic like a razor-sharp blade. "She is my role. Anyone who breathes a single word against her or dares to look at her twice will share his exact fate." He placed his hand firmly on the small of Clara's back and guided her toward the exit, leaving the dead man behind for the cleaners. The message was loud and incredibly clear to everyone present. The fragile piece of the Chicago underworld had just been violently shattered beyond repair. The war was no longer an approaching storm. It had officially begun, and the blood of their enemies was the only currency Julian Vance would ever accept. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open before dawn the very next morning. The brutal execution at the gala had ignited a massive inferno across the city. The Sterling Syndicate and their allied factions were already retaliating. Julian knew the glass walls of the high-rise penthouse were no longer an impenetrable fortress. They were a glowing target. He stormed into the master bedroom where Clara was sitting awake on the edge of the silk mattress. The memory of the loud crack of Garrett's neck still haunted her racing mind. Julian did not offer any gentle reassurance. His face was set in a rigid mask of absolute authority. He ordered her to gather her things immediately. There was no time for explanations. Within 10 minutes, Clara was shoved into the back of a heavily armored convoy tearing through the quiet streets of Chicago before the sun even touched the horizon. They drove for 2 agonizingly silent hours deep into the dense forests bordering the city limits. The vehicles finally passed through towering iron gates, stopping in front of a sprawling concrete safe house isolated from the rest of the world. It was a brutalist structure surrounded by armed guards and high-voltage wire. It was not a sanctuary. It was a highly fortified bunker. Julian escorted her inside, but his demeanor had shifted entirely. The fierce protective fire he had displayed at the gala was completely gone, replaced by the icy detachment of a warlord preparing for a bloodbath. He confiscated the only phone she had been given. He instructed the head of security that Clara was not to leave the perimeter under any circumstances, and she was barred from contacting the outside world. Complete communication blackout. Clara stared at him, feeling a sudden sharp sting in her chest. She had thought they had reached a quiet understanding. She had thought the tender moment when he traced her wrist and the furious way he had defended her honor meant something real. But as she watched his cold, pitch-black eyes, she felt a crushing wave of profound betrayal. She believed he was locking her away because she was a liability. The street rat had caused a massive war, and now the ghost was hiding his broken toy in the woods so he could deal with the real adults. He was discarding her. "Julian," she called out softly as he turned to leave the barren living room. He stopped, but he did not look back. If he looked at her, he knew his resolve would shatter. He needed pure, unadulterated hatred to slaughter the men coming for his throne. Any lingering warmth would get them both killed. "Stay inside," Julian commanded, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do exactly what the guards tell you. I will return when the streets are clean." Without another word, he walked out. The heavy steel door slammed shut, echoing with a terrible finality. Clara was left entirely alone in the massive empty house. The suffocating silence crept back and wrapping around her fragile heart. The familiar, painful sting of abandonment washed over her. First her mother had sold her away, and now the monster who had claimed to protect her was trapping her in a concrete cage and throwing away the key. Miles away, in a luxurious study reeking of expensive incense and dark secrets, Victoria Sterling was pacing furiously across a Persian rug. Her pristine image had been completely shattered by the public humiliation at the gala. Sitting in a leather armchair watching her manic pacing was Silas Thorne. Silas was not a brute like the men Julian typically slaughtered. He was a highly educated psychopath, a master of psychological manipulation who destroyed his enemies from the inside out. He preferred the quiet torture of the mind over the loud violence of a gun. "Pacing will not bring your precious alliance back, Victoria," Silas stated calmly, taking a slow sip of his black tea. "I want that little street rat dead," Victoria hissed, her blue eyes wide with unhinged malice. "I want Julian to watch her bleed out." Silas smiled, a chilling, hollow expression that did not reach his pale eyes. "Death is incredibly boring, my dear. And Julian expects a frontal assault. He has locked his little treasure inside his most secure compound. An army could not breach those concrete walls." Victoria stopped glaring at him with pure hatred. "Then what do you suggest we do?" Silas set his teacup down with a soft, deliberate click. "We do not need an army to breach a fortress if we already have the key. Julian trusts his inner circle entirely too much. A fatal flaw for a king." Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "I have just purchased the loyalty of the night shift commander at the safe house. We are not going to kill the girl Victoria. We are going to break her mind until she does the killing for us." The isolation inside the concrete bunker stretched into its third agonizing day. The passage of time became a blurred nightmare. Clara paced the sterile floors, the deafening silence feeding her deepest insecurities. She felt entirely discarded. Julian had not sent a single message since he locked her in this vault. Her mind spiraled into dark corners, convinced that the Mafia King had finally realized she was nothing more than a liability. She was a street rat who had ignited a massive underworld war, and now she was hidden away, a forgotten to a gathering dust while the real monsters fought for the city. Late on the fourth night, the heavy electronic lock on her bedroom door clicked open with a soft hiss. Clara spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, expecting Julian to finally return. Instead, the night shift commander stepped inside, closing the heavy steel door swiftly behind him. His name was Evans, a man Julian trusted implicitly. But tonight, Evans looked around with calculated paranoia, sweat beading on his forehead. He handed her a thick manila folder. His hands trembled, executing a perfect performance of terrified urgency. He whispered that he was risking his own life by being here, but his conscience could not allow him to stand by and let innocent blood be spilled. Clara slowly opened the folder. Inside were crisp surveillance photographs of her old apartment building. Red circles marked the exact windows of her childhood home. Beneath the photos lay a printed directive bearing the unmistakable jagged signature of Julian Vance. The orders were explicitly clear. The strike team was instructed to eliminate Sarah and Marcus before dawn. The document stated that the bloodline needed to be severed to prevent the Sterling Syndicate from using them as leverage. They were loose ends, and the ghost of Chicago left no loose ends. Clara felt the cold air leave her lungs. Her mother had sold her for $1 million. Sarah had fed her to a monster to save a gambling addict. But the visceral horror of her own flesh and blood being slaughtered entirely because of her existence shattered Clara completely. The fragile armor she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. Her deep-rooted empathy, the very flaw she swore to bury, flared into a blinding panic. She could not let them die. Logic screamed at her to stay put, to remember Julian's fierce protection at the gala, but the forged signature burned into her retinas. The brutal image of Julian snapping a man's neck surfaced, reinforcing the terrifying reality of his ruthless nature. He was a killer. Why would he spare a mother who had already proven herself worthless? Evans offered her a desperate choice. He claimed he had disabled the security cameras on the western perimeter for exactly 5 minutes. He handed her a black keycard and a dark hooded rain jacket, urging her to run immediately if she wanted to save her family from the slaughter. Clara grabbed the jacket without another second of hesitation. She slipped out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She navigated the dark corridors like a ghost, avoiding the main patrol routes exactly as Evans had instructed. She swiped the card at the secondary gate. The heavy iron clicked open, allowing her to slip into the freezing torrential rain outside. Clara plunged into the dense wetwoods. The mud grabbed at her shoes, and low branches tore at her clothes, but she pushed her fragile body to the absolute limit. Every shadow looked like an assassin, every crack of thunder sounded like gunfire. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, driven entirely by the desperate need to reach the city before Julian's executioners did. She finally emerged onto the desolate highway bordering the forest, entirely soaked and shivering violently. A sleek black sedan was idling by the side of the broken asphalt, its headlights cutting through the heavy downpour. Clara assumed it was a passing vehicle or perhaps a cab, desperately raising her hand to flag it down. The passenger door swung open, but the man who stepped out into the pouring rain was not a savior. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, holding a black umbrella with eerie calm. Silas Thorne smiled, his pale eyes completely devoid of warmth. Before Clara could even register the danger, 2 massive figures emerged silently from the shadows of the trees directly behind her. A damp cloth smelling sharply of harsh chemicals was pressed violently over her nose and mouth. Clara thrashed wildly, her nails clawing at the thick arms restraining her, but the chemical burned her throat and filled her lungs. Her vision instantly began to blur, the dark trees spinning out of control. As the terrifying darkness pulled her under, Silas stepped closer, leaning under his umbrella. His chilling voice echoed over the roaring storm, welcoming his new puppet to her beautiful nightmare. She realized in her final second of consciousness that there was no execution order. It had all been a brilliantly wicked trap, and she had walked right into it. Clara woke to an agonizing blinding light that seared straight through her closed eyelids. She tried to raise her hand to shield her face, but thick leather straps bound her wrists tightly to the arms of a cold metal chair. Her ankles were similarly restrained, restricting her to complete immobility. Panic flared hot and sharp in her chest. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent glare. She was sitting in the exact center of an entirely white room. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was a stark, sterile white. There were no windows and no visible doors. It felt less like a prison cell and more like a horrific psychological laboratory. The pungent metallic scent of ozone and strong antiseptic hung thick in the freezing air. Clara struggled wildly against the thick leather restraints, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. The memory of the freezing rain, the black sedan, and the chemical rag crashed back into her mind. She had been foolish. She had run straight into the arms of the enemy. A soft melodic hum drifted from the corner of the blinding white room. A hidden door entirely flush with the wall swung open seamlessly. Silas Thorne strolled inside wearing a pristine white lab coat over his immaculate gray suit. He carried a small silver tray holding a single clear syringe filled with an ominous glowing blue liquid. "Welcome back to the waking world, Clara," Silas murmured, his voice incredibly smooth and hypnotic. He did not sound like a mobster. He sounded like a soothing, highly educated therapist. It was utterly terrifying. Clara glared at him, her amber eyes burning with fierce defiance despite her helpless position. "Where am I? What do you want from me?" Silas set the silver tray on a pristine white table beside her chair. He pulled up a stool and sat down, crossing one long leg over the other. "I want absolutely nothing from you, my dear. I merely wish to help you see the truth. The profound, painful truth that Julian Vance has hidden from you." Julian did not hide anything. Clara spat venomously, struggling against the thick leather straps. "I saw the execution order. He was going to murder my mother." Silas offered a slow, pitying smile that made Clara's blood run completely cold. "Oh, Clara, your loyalty to an abusive family is truly tragic. But that poorly forged document was merely the bait to bring you to me. The real tragedy is what Julian has actually done to your mind." Silas stood up and picked up the syringe. Before Clara could scream, he drove the long needle expertly into the main vein on the side of her neck, plunging the glowing blue liquid directly into her bloodstream. The effects were instantaneous and violently jarring. Fire ripped through her veins, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. The pristine white walls of the room began to warp and melt, dripping like hot wax. A deafening high-pitched ringing filled her ears, drowning out her own terrified screams. "Breathe deeply, Clara," Silas commanded, his voice suddenly echoing from all directions, simultaneously filling her entire skull. "The medicine is breaking down the walls of his lies. Look into the shadows. Remember what he truly is." The powerful hallucinogen hijacked her nervous system entirely. Silas stepped back, blending into the shifting, melting walls. He activated a hidden projector, bathing the white room in chaotic, distorted images. The horrific scene from the gala played out on a continuous, maddening loop. Julian's massive hand gripping Garrett's neck. The sickening crack echoing endlessly. But Silas used his hypnotic cadence to twist the narrative entirely. He warped the memory, feeding her fractured mind a new terrifying reality. "Look at the monster," Silas whispered, the words slipping smoothly into her consciousness like poison. "He did not protect you, Clara. He killed that man simply because he enjoys the blood. He is a parasite. He purchased you not out of mercy, but because he needs a helpless victim to witness his cruelty. He killed your freedom. He killed your spirit. And soon he will kill you just like he slaughtered the others." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, crying out in absolute agony, but the images burned directly onto her retinas. Silas paced around the metal chair, his voice a constant soothing drumbeat eroding her resistance. He used gaslighting with terrifying precision. He fed her distorted memories, making her believe Julian had orchestrated her mother's gambling debt from the very beginning just to trap her. He convinced her that the quiet, tender moment when she had bandaged his wound was a calculated manipulation designed to make her docile. "He's the devil who ruined your life," Silas chanted the mantra over and over, tapping rhythmically on the metal frame of the chair. "He is the disease. You are the cure. You must kill the disease to be free. You must kill Julian Vance." Hours bled into days inside the blinding white laboratory. The brutal cycle of chemical injections, sleep deprivation, and relentless psychological conditioning broke down her psyche brick by fragile brick. Silas tore away her memories, her deep empathy, and her quiet strength, leaving behind an empty, echoing void. He then carefully filled that void with pure, concentrated hatred directed entirely at Julian. By the end of the fourth day, the struggling ceased entirely. Clara sat perfectly still in the metal chair, her amber eyes completely glassy and utterly devoid of human emotion. She was no longer the compassionate barista who had endured her family's abuse. She was no longer the resilient girl who had defied a Mafia King. The vibrant soul had been completely extinguished. Silas walked over and gently unbuckled the thick leather straps. Clara did not move. She remained rigidly upright, staring straight ahead into the blinding white void. Silas picked up a heavy loaded revolver from the silver tray and placed it carefully into her cold, unresisting hand. "What is your singular purpose, Clara?" Silas asked, his voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction. Clara wrapped her small fingers tightly around the cold steel grip of the gun. She did not blink. Her voice was a hollow, chilling monotone devoid of any hesitation or fear. "I must kill the disease. I must kill Julian Vance." The heavy iron gates of the safe house swung open to admit Julian Vance. The torrential rain from the previous night had finally ceased, leaving behind a suffocating damp fog that clung to the dense forest. He had spent the last 48 hours systematically dismantling the Sterling supply lines, but an unsettling cold knot in his gut had forced him to return early. When he stepped into the brutalist concrete bunker, the unnatural silence immediately triggered his predatory instincts. He bypassed his security detail and strode directly to the master bedroom. The heavy steel door was unlocked. The room was entirely empty. The bed had not been slept in. Julian stood frozen in the doorway. His pitch-black eyes scanned the pristine space, instantly locking onto the manila folder discarded on the floor. He picked it up and read the forged execution order bearing a clumsy replication of his own signature. The cold knot in his stomach exploded into a blinding, consuming inferno. The calculated, composed Mafia King vanished in an instant. The ghost of Chicago awoke, and he was starving for blood. Within 10 minutes, the night shift commander Evans was dragged kicking and screaming into the barren living room. Two massive guards forced the traitor to his knees before Julian. Evans wept openly, begging for his miserable life, spewing frantic excuses about being blackmailed. Julian did not shout. He did not ask questions. He simply drew his heavy silver firearm and shot Evans in the right kneecap. The deafening blast echoed off the concrete walls, followed by a horrific, agonizing scream. Julian walked forward and pressed the smoking barrel directly against the center of Evans' forehead. His voice was a terrifying, hollow whisper that promised absolute damnation. "Who took her?" "Silas." Evans choked out, coughing up a thick spray of blood. "Silas Thorne. He paid me to let her out. He was waiting on the highway." Julian pulled the trigger without a single flicker of hesitation. The loud crack ended the traitor instantly. Julian stepped over the lifeless body and turned to his horrified lieutenants. The order he gave next completely shattered decades of established underworld protocol. There would be no strategic planning. There would be no defensive posturing. Every single heavily armed man loyal to the Vance syndicate was summoned. They were going to war, and they were not going to stop until the city drowned in the blood of their enemies. The rampage began precisely at noon. Julian personally led an elite strike team of 50 heavily armed assassins straight into the heart of the Sterling and Thorne territories. They did not strike from the shadows. They kicked down the front doors of illegal casinos, luxury brothels, and underground smuggling warehouses in broad daylight. Julian fought like a man completely possessed by a demon. He abandoned his usual flawless technique, opting for brutal, overwhelming violence. He tore through armed guards, snapping limbs and shattering skulls with a terrifying, raw physical power. He was covered in the blood of his enemies, but he did not slow down for a single second. Every high-ranking lieutenant belonging to Silas Thorne was dragged out into the streets and subjected to unspeakable horrors. Julian did not delegate the interrogations. He rolled up the sleeves of his ruined designer shirt and extracted the information himself using methods so exceedingly vicious that even his own hardened killers had to look away. He broke fingers, crushed ribs, and shattered kneecaps, demanding a single answer. For 12 grueling hours, Chicago burned. The police sirens wailed in the distance, but the authorities were entirely too terrified to intervene in the apocalyptic Mafia massacre. Julian tore the underworld apart brick by bloody brick. The agonizing memory of Clara bandaging his wound, the fierce defiance in her amber eyes fueled a desperation he had never known. She was not a pet. She was his very soul, and someone had dared to steal her. As midnight approached, Julian kicked down the reinforced steel door of a hidden basement beneath a meatpacking plant. He cornered Silas Thorne's right-hand man, a towering brute named Victor. Victor tried to draw a weapon, but Julian moved with blinding speed, driving a combat knife straight through the man's palm, pinning his hand directly to the wooden table. Victor screamed in agony, sinking to his knees. Julian leaned in close, his face a terrifying mask of absolute murderous wrath. His pitch-black eyes promised an eternity of suffering. "Where is the lavatory?" Julian demanded, twisting the heavy blade slightly. Victor sobbed heavily, the pain breaking his loyalty completely. He gave up the location, an abandoned psychiatric hospital hidden deep in the industrial sector on the far south side of the city. He swore Silas was keeping the girl there. Julian ripped the knife free and signaled his men to finish the job. He turned and walked out into the freezing night air, reloading his heavy silver firearm. He had the address. The ghost was coming to collect his queen, and he would gladly burn the entire world to ash to get her back. The abandoned psychiatric hospital loomed in the dead of night like a decaying monument to madness. Julian Vance did not bother with stealth. His elite strike team breached the perimeter with explosive force, completely overwhelming the scattered guards Silas had left outside. Julian moved through the rotting corridors like a wraith of vengeance. The peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights blurred past him as he tracked the hum of a hidden generator deep into the subterranean levels. At the end of a long, damp hallway stood a reinforced steel door. Julian did not signal his men to follow. He ordered them to hold the perimeter. He wanted Silas Thorne all to himself. With a massive surge of brute strength, Julian kicked the heavy door off its rusted hinges, shattering the lock completely. The deafening crash echoed through the blinding white room beyond. Julian stepped into the stark, glaring light, his silver firearm raised and ready to deliver absolute death. But the terrifying sight that greeted him caused the ghost of Chicago to freeze completely. He did not find an army of henchmen. He did not find Silas cowering in a corner. Standing directly in the center of the sterile room was Clara. She looked incredibly small against the vast expanse of white. Her beautiful amber eyes, once so full of fierce resilience and deep compassion, were now entirely glassy and hollow. They were dark voids devoid of any human warmth. But what stopped his heart entirely was the heavy steel revolver gripped tightly in her pale, trembling hands. The barrel was raised, pointing directly at his chest. A slow, mocking applause echoed from the corner of the room. Silas Thorne stepped out of the melting shadows wearing an immaculate gray suit, completely unbothered by the violence raging above them. He smiled, a chilling, hollow expression of pure triumph. He stood safely behind Clara, resting his hands gently on her rigid shoulders like a proud puppeteer admiring his favorite masterpiece. "Right on time, Julian," Silas murmured, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "I must admit, watching you tear Chicago apart was highly entertaining. But brute force is so incredibly primitive. True power lies in the fragile mind." Julian ignored the psychopath entirely. His pitch-black eyes remained locked onto Clara. The heavy iron walls around his heart cracked wide open, seeing the absolute devastation inflicted upon her. He could see the faint tremor in her small fingers and the unnatural rigidness of her posture. Silas had broken her. The monster had ripped away the beautiful soul Julian had sworn to protect. "Clara," Julian said softly, his deep voice completely devoid of its usual lethal authority. "Put the gun down. I am here to take you home." Clara did not blink. She did not lower the weapon. Her voice emerged as a chilling, robotic monotone echoing the poison Silas had injected into her veins. "You are the disease. I must kill the disease." Silas chuckled softly, stepping slightly to the side. "She cannot hear you, Julian. Her mind belongs entirely to me now. If you take a single step forward or raise your weapon, I will give her the final command. But she will not shoot you. She will place that heavy barrel directly against her own temple and pull the trigger." The air in the room turned entirely to ice. The ultimate ultimatum hung heavy in the blinding white light. Silas wanted to witness the absolute humiliation of the invincible Mafia King. He wanted the ghost to surrender everything he stood for. Julian Vance had built his entire empire on absolute dominance. He had never bowed to any man. He had never pleaded for mercy. But as he looked into her empty eyes, the paradox of his dark existence became incredibly clear. All the power, all the wealth, and all the fear he commanded meant absolutely nothing if she was not breathing. Without a single second of hesitation, Julian slowly opened his hands. The heavy silver firearm he had used to conquer the city clattered loudly against the sterile white floor. He kicked it away. Then the most ruthless devil in the criminal underworld did the unimaginable. Julian slowly bent his knees and lowered his massive frame to the cold ground. He knelt before the broken girl and the smirking psychopath, offering his own life as a willing sacrifice. He surrendered his crown, his pride, and his absolute power entirely to protect the only woman he would ever love. Silas Thorne threw his head back and laughed. The cruel hollow sound bounced off the sterile white walls, amplifying the absolute absurdity of the moment. The ghost of Chicago, the most feared predator in the criminal underworld, was kneeling on the cold floor, completely defenseless. Silas felt a euphoric rush of divine power. He had achieved what rival syndicates and armies of assassins had failed to do for a decade. He had broken the untouchable king, and he had used a fragile little street rat to do it. Silas paced around Julian like a ravenous vulture circling a dying beast. He mocked the fallen king, gloating about the brilliant simplicity of his psychological trap. But Julian did not offer Silas a single glance. He did not hear the taunts. The entire universe had narrowed down to the trembling girl standing a few feet away. Clara kept the heavy revolver leveled directly at his heart. Her amber eyes remained trapped in that terrifying glassy void. The lethal chemical cocktail Silas had pumped into her veins was fighting to maintain total control over her fractured mind. "Finish it, my dear," Silas commanded, his voice dripping with poisonous authority. "Pull the trigger. Erase the disease and claim your absolute freedom." Clara took a stiff, mechanical step forward. Her knuckles turned stark white as her small finger tightened significantly around the cold steel trigger. The hammer of the gun clicked back with a sharp metallic snap. Julian did not close his eyes. He did not brace for the imminent impact. Instead, he looked deeply into the empty abyss of her gaze and spoke. He did not use the commanding, terrifying rumble of the Mafia King. He used a voice Clara had only heard once before in the quiet, blood-stained aftermath of a brutal night. It was a voice filled with profound, agonizing tenderness. "Clara," Julian whispered. The single word resonated through the blinding white room, carrying the weight of his entire blackened soul. "Look at me. Look closely at the man kneeling before you." Clara froze. The gun wavered a fraction of an inch. A violent tremor rocked her small frame. Inside her mind, a catastrophic war had just been ignited. The hypnotic programming screamed at her to shoot the monster to end the nightmare, but the raw vulnerability in his voice was a massive blunt force, striking the glass walls of her conditioning. "I am a killer," Julian continued, his dark eyes shining with an unfamiliar moisture. "I am the darkness you are always warned about. I have ruined lives and I have bathed the city in blood. But you are the only pure thing I have ever touched. From the very first moment you defied me in my own home, I knew you are my salvation. You are the only light in my miserable existence, Clara." Silas stopped pacing, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. "Do not listen to his lies," Silas hissed, stepping closer to her. "Shoot him now." Julian ignored the psychopath, completely pouring every ounce of his desperate love into his words. "Do you remember the night you bandaged my wound? You could have let me die, but your beautiful heart refused to let me bleed out. You saved me, Clara. You saved me from myself. If my death is the price to set you free from this chemical hell, I will gladly take your bullet. But please, my brilliant, beautiful girl, do not let this parasite extinguish your soul. Fight him. Come back to me." A sudden agonizing scream tore through Clara's throat. She squeezed her eyes shut as a crushing, blinding headache threatened to split her skull wide open. The sterile room spun wildly out of control. Silas Thorne's hypnotic mantra clashed violently with the warm, steady cadence of Julian's desperate plea. The fabricated memories of Julian slaughtering her family began to fracture, melting away like ice under a scorching sun. Through the agonizing mental fog, the truth aggressively fought its way to the surface. She remembered Julian shielding her from Garrett. She remembered the fierce, protective fire in his pitch-black eyes. She remembered the gentle touch of his thumb tracing her wrist. He was not the disease. He was the man who loved her fiercely enough to surrender his entire empire. I said pull the trigger. Silas roared, losing his polished, therapeutic facade completely. He lunged forward, reaching for her shoulder to force compliance. But Clara opened her eyes. The terrifying glassy void was completely gone. In its place burned a wild, ferocious fire of absolute clarity and unyielding resilience. The girl who had survived decades of abuse, the woman who had refused to bow to the elite, had finally broken the heavy chains of her psychological prison. In one blindingly fast, fluid motion fueled by pure adrenaline and the immense power of her buried love, Clara pivoted sharply on her heel. She swung the heavy steel revolver away from Julian and aimed it dead center at the chest of the immaculate gray suit. Silas Thorne froze, his pale eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared down the dark barrel of his own weapon. He realized in that split second that he had severely underestimated the unbreakable spirit of a girl with nothing left to lose. Clara did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the pristine white laboratory. The heavy caliber bullet struck Silas squarely in the heart. The impact threw the psychopath backward, his body crashing violently against the sterile table before crumbling into a lifeless heap on the floor. A pool of dark crimson blood rapidly spread across the immaculate white tiles, ruining his masterpiece forever. The heavy revolver slipped from Clara's trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the floor. The massive surge of adrenaline instantly evaporated, leaving her completely hollow and exhausted. Her knees buckled under the immense weight of the mental trauma, and she collapsed forward into the blinding light. She never hit the ground. Julian caught her in his massive arms, pulling her incredibly tight against his chest. He buried his face in her damp hair, holding her as if the universe would collapse if he let go. Clara wrapped her arms weakly around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder, and finally, after weeks of agonizing terror, the first real tears fell silently, soaking into his ruined shirt. She was safe. The ghost had come for her, and together they had killed the devil. The cleanup of the Sterling and Thorne factions was executed swiftly and ruthlessly over the next 48 hours. With Silas dead and her loyal army entirely decimated, Victoria was captured and banished completely from the city. Her once powerful family empire was reduced to absolute ashes. The violent war was decisively over. Julian Vance stood alone as the undisputed ruler of the Chicago underworld. Before fully embracing her new life, Clara needed absolute closure. She arranged a brief meeting with Sarah in a quiet, heavily guarded public park. Sarah looked frantic and desperate, her gambling addictions still tearing her life apart. Clara handed her mother a thick envelope containing enough cash to survive comfortably, but her amber eyes held absolutely zero warmth or pity. "This is the very last time we will ever speak," Clara stated, her voice remarkably steady and resolute. "You sold your own flesh and blood to save a monster. My forgiveness has ended today. I am no longer your child." Sarah reached out, crying frantically, but Clara turned her back and walked away toward the waiting armored vehicle, finally breaking the toxic chains of her past completely and forever. 1 week later, the ruling council of the remaining syndicates gathered in the grand hall of the Vance estate to formally acknowledge the new hierarchy. The heavy oak doors swung open. Julian walked in, radiating absolute fear and unquestionable authority. But every single pair of eyes in the room was immediately drawn to the woman walking beside him. Clara had completely shed the faded clothes and the fragile demeanor of a terrified waitress. She wore a stunning, perfectly tailored black gown that commanded immense respect and dark elegance. She did not walk a step behind him. She walked exactly at his side. When Julian took his seat at the head of the massive mahogany table, Clara sat right next to him. She met the terrified, respectful gazes of the city elite with a calm, unyielding stare. The vulnerable girl was gone forever. The queen of the underworld had officially arrived, and she would rule the darkness beside her king for the rest of their lives. What an incredibly intense and emotional journey we have just experienced together. This story brings us a profound life lesson about the true meaning of family and resilience. Sometimes the people who share our blood are the ones who hurt us the most, and true family is built on loyalty, protection, and unconditional love. Clara taught us that no matter how dark our circumstances are, we have the power to break toxic cycles, find our own hidden strength, and rewrite our destiny. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate Clara's painful struggles or her ultimate triumph to anything in your own real life? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We truly want to listen to the deep feelings from the bottom of your heart. If you love this story, please hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video so you can listen to many captivating stories every single day. We also want to wish everyone watching this video wonderful health, a joyful life every day, and absolute peace. Goodbye and see you in the next video.